kind of equate it to jumping out of airplanes in the Army. You're not a little bit nervous going out the door. There's something wrong with you. But when you open that hatch, the hatch is facing the Earth always. It's on the bottom side of the space station. And so when you open the hatch and you go out, generally you're going to go out head first. Sometimes you come out feet first. But regardless, you're going to end up in a heads up attitude where your feet are towards the Earth and your head's kind of towards the hatch. And they give you about 5 to 10 minutes if you need it, or if you want it, to just hang out and chill and try to figure out how little it takes to move around. Because on your first one, you're going to death grip everything generally because you're so jacked up and you just don't know how little it takes to move around outside in a big spacesuit.
Welcome back, team, for another week of just really titillating conversation between Alex, myself, and this week, an astronaut. Alex?
Yeah, this one's been in the works for a while. Pretty exciting stuff.
It's out of this world.
It is out of this world.
Sorry.
Our guest on this one is Colonel retired Shane Kimbrough. He is a 1989 West Point graduate where he was captain of the baseball team. He commissioned as an aviation officer and flew Apache attack helicopters, including in Desert Storm. He got his Master's of Science degree at the Georgia Institute of Technology in 1998 and headed back to West Point to teach in the math department. And if I'm doing the math right on the timeline here, it would have been while he was teaching at West Point that he got selected by NASA to be an astronaut because he entered that program in 2004.
Which, by the way, is really hard to get selected to be an astronaut.
Just a little bit. Yeah, slightly selective. After training with NASA, he completed his first space flight on STS-126, which was one of the last shuttle missions where they were building the International Space Station. He spent almost 16 days on the mission to expand the crew living quarters to accommodate a 6-member crew on the ISS, including performing 2 spacewalks. On his second spaceflight, he launched to the ISS on the Russian Soyuz MS-02 spacecraft from the Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan. This mission lasted 173 days as part of Expeditions 49 and 50, where he performed 4 spacewalks and numerous science and maintenance activities. He most recently served as the commander of the NASA/SpaceX Crew-2 Dragon spacecraft, which launched from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. Once on the ISS, he served as flight engineer for Expeditions 65 and 66. He performed 3 spacewalks during the 199-day mission for a total of 388 days in space.
And I just want to point out that Alex and I are very, very professional when it comes to interviewing our guests, bringing them on the episode. However, I think the casual listener will very quickly realize that a massive amount of just pure boyhood curiosity made its way into some of our questions. We laid out a very constructive plan, and we did, dive into a lot of interesting conversations. But we were also curious, like, what does the International Space Station smell like? What is it like to float around in space? So there's a lot of that peppered in here. But I mean, how often do you get to interview a real life astronaut? So definitely a unique experience. Definitely one of those really cool kind of check yourself moments when it comes to starting a podcast. And I will also point out that this has become part 1 of a 4-part series of episodes that we've sort of dubbed the NASA series. So you'll hear today from Shane, and then we'll have 2 episodes with the human performance team that supports these NASA missions, and a final episode with the research side of the house in terms of future developments around human physiology, I suppose, in space.
And it's worth explaining how it turned into a series too, because we approached Shane in the first place because he's uniquely interested in human performance and fitness kind of things, even for an astronaut. And over the course of the conversation with him, he kind of made it clear that the ACERs, the Astronaut Strength Conditioning and Rehab team, were an invaluable part of his preparation for spaceflight, maintaining and even improving his fitness during spaceflight, and his ability to rehab and continue the mission after those flights. And so because of his endorsement of that team and his excitement about the topic and things like that, this kind of grew into something a little bigger where we're going to talk to that team as well, hear their experiences from being the strength and conditioning and rehab professionals, and then dive into the research side of it a little bit as well. So a pretty cool series of episodes here.
Enjoy. the argument that Alex and I were having before you came on, and you may have heard the tail end of it, was one of the things I wanted to ask was if it's even possible to come back to Earth stronger than when you left. And originally Alex just dismissed it off the cuff, and then he thought about it and he's like, "Oh, hold on, maybe there is a way." So
my case was, I know I'm not certainly an expert on like space flight human performance stuff by any means, but I've nerded out enough to read a little bit, and I know about some of the, and this is what I'm going to ask you about up front, I guess, but the consequences on bone density, the consequences on muscle mass, even on like vision and blood flow throughout your body and things like that. So I guess Drew's question is it possible to come back from space stronger than you left? And the follow on is, can you just kind of talk about like the consequences of your body on spending extended time in space?
Yeah, for sure. I generally think I've come back stronger both of my long duration missions.
yes.
I mean, honestly, you're working out for 2 hours a day, pretty much every day, right? For 6+ months. So even on Earth, we don't get that luxury, right? And so if you worked out 2 hours a day on Earth for 6 months straight, you would be stronger at the end, right? Now your coordination and your stability is not great when you get back. But in general, I think I was stronger. And we do like it's not a physical fitness test like the military would do, but it's now NASA's version. And you do that a few days after you get back. And generally I've been, more reps, more weight than I did prior to leaving. And I work out quite a bit. So, if you don't work out, it kind of changes that dynamic, but I'm one that likes to work out on Earth and in space.
So just to be clear, Alex was wrong. I was right. And just as a caveat, I can't think of too many people that can say that they are stronger on Earth than they are in space. That's a pretty cool statement to be able to make.
So now I'm curious because, and we mentioned this in the email conversation before you got here, but I had a great conversation with Judy from the human performance team at Johnson, and like a bunch of questions came from that. One being, and I'm like skipping around on some stuff here. We'll have to try and get some sort of narrative flow eventually. But correct me if I'm wrong, the spacesuit is like 280 or 300 pounds, which doesn't matter a whole lot in zero gravity.
I don't think it matters at all in zero gravity.
But like you're like in that when you arrive back at Earth, and like how do you train for something like that? Like can you even stand up when you get back? Like, I'm curious about that.
So just to clear it up, the spacesuit that weighs that much is the one that we do spacewalks in.
Okay.
Those stay on orbit. So those aren't the ones we launch and land in. The ones we launch and land in are varying weights, but I don't even know what the SpaceX suit I launched and landed in recently was probably 30 pounds or something. So not heavy at all. But yeah, if you came back in a 280-pound suit, you'd be struggling to stand up for sure.
Wait, but aren't the official NASA pictures in the spacewalking suit?
Correct.
On Earth? So I would presume that you do have to, in some sense, navigate with that thing, or is it just like the suit up, like in high school prom pictures, where you just have the?
Yeah, great question and great observation, actually. So that photo shoot that we do to get the pictures in those, it's a pretty grueling 30 to 45 minutes, and there's actually people underneath you holding the weight of the pack up and down. But it's hard. It's freezing in that room because, I mean, within a few minutes, you'd just be sweating because you're working, just trying to maintain stability in that, several 100-pound suit. So, yeah, that's pretty crazy. You picked up on that.
You know what? That was definitely not a direction we were thinking of going in. But now that I think, I just picture you guys. Every picture I see now of an astronaut in that suit, I'm picturing 3 guys underneath them holding up. Yeah, it's awesome.
And we're grimacing and we'll mix in a smile every now and then that they get the picture of, I think.
You guys are
so cool.
Reenacting the scene from Men of Honor, I think is the movie, right? We have to like walk in the dive suit. That's fantastic.
Let's go back to the beginning here. I'm going to cut Alex off because I know that a question people are going to have anytime you talk to somebody who's been to space, there's always the obvious question of what is the process of becoming an astronaut? And I know you were in the military. So what does that look like to become, or I guess I should say, to go from being in the military to sitting on a rocket as it's about to launch into space?
Yeah, there's several avenues to become an astronaut. Military is one route, and as most people still think all the astronauts are military, but that's a thing of the past. That's really back in the Mercury, Gemini, Apollo days, that was true. But once the space shuttle days started, then scientists and engineers and researchers and payload specialists started adding to the list. And currently there's teachers, doctors, and all those others mentioned above. And so my route was through the military. Back in those days, in the space shuttle days, about every other year, there was a selection cycle. And if you were in the military, in my case, the Army would send out an official message. Hey, if you want to apply for the astronaut program, here's what you got to do. And so that's how I personally did it. Other people from the civilian sector, a NASA-wide announcement would go out and they would apply through that process. And then, I applied and I applied again and I applied again. And I applied again. So I think I wore them down finally after the fourth or fifth time. And I got lucky enough to get an interview and then get selected shortly after that.
So before we continue into some of the physiology and fitness questions, once you got selected, what does it take through that process? Because I know, looking at your bio, you weren't an astronaut instantly once you were with NASA. There are other jobs you did within NASA and things like that. What's the process of making it all the way to the guy in the suit situation?
Yeah. So once you get selected as an astronaut, you come in as a class. Our class had 11, they're generally from 8 to 12-ish or so, kind of that, average of about 10 these days anyway. And so you come in and you're called astronaut candidates. You're called ASCANs. So just to make sure you keep your humility while you're here. And you go about 2 years as an astronaut candidate. And through those 2 years, depending on in my case, when I came in the space shuttle days, we're learning about space shuttle systems and orbital mechanics, and you're getting in the simulator and you're flying T-38s and you're going to survival school and you're doing all these things that as a class and as smaller groups within your class potentially, but you're really bonding as a class. You're learning obviously tons of stuff. You're taking exams. Every time you take an exam, you're getting rank ordered, in our case 1 to 11. And at the end of those 2 years, they stack you up, and pretty much the folks at the top will generally fly first. And they kind of go down from there. That doesn't always happen, but that's kind of the theory anyway. And so those 2 years are pretty grueling. And so once you get through that, you'll have a big ceremony where you're, at that point, they call you an astronaut, not an astronaut candidate, even though you hadn't been to space, but you're able to be assigned to a space flight. And so that's a big day. But then honestly, it takes a couple more years, 4 more years, 6 more years sometimes before you would ever be in a vehicle launching after that date. So it's a process. You can't just get there and go fly in space. To be a professional NASA astronaut, I should say, of course, folks are doing that these days where they're not training very much and getting a chance to go to space. But to be a NASA astronaut, that's the process.
So for the physical preparation for it, and I have lots of questions in this area, but what did your physical training protocol look like as you got ready for that? And within that, was that a protocol that was given to you by NASA? Or are there specific parameters you need to achieve or things they're looking for, or how much of it was kind of driven by you?
Yeah, honestly, it's really self-motivated, I would say. Some people just working out wasn't their thing, right? But, I wouldn't say got talked into it, but they saw the benefit of doing it as you got ready for a space flight, especially if you're going to be a spacewalker. That's, I would say, the most physical thing that we do in space. And so we have incredible trainers called ACERs, Astronaut Strength Conditioning and Rehabilitation specialists and coaches that we have that work individually with us as you're getting ready for a flight. Once you get assigned to a mission, then you have one of those personal ACERs assigned to you that will get you trained on all the equipment that you're going to use in space, for one, but also, just help your physical fitness, improve as you're getting closer to launch. If, for someone like myself, that's what I wanted to do. Some people maybe don't care that much about it, but I did. And so we worked real hard and just, improved my flexibility, improved my, stamina, improved my strength, and all those things kind of combined as you're getting ready to go fly in space.
You mentioned the ACERs, and I can imagine that would be a very different environment than I think what most people who listen to this deal with, in the sense that, you might have one coach for 500 people. And in your case, it's a 1-to-1. So I'm curious, what does maybe not into the X's and O's of what the training looks like, but in terms of dialing in your individual physiology and prepping for being in space, I can only imagine that's a pretty technical process. What did that look like from getting ready to launch?
Yeah, I kind of mentioned before, but you're going to have, I forget the number, say about 16 training sessions on the workout equipment that you're going to have in space, like the machine called ARED. And that's really important. And you can't simulate it. It's not the same. It's the same piece of machinery, but it just doesn't work the same in gravity, right? It gets you used to kind of setting it up, doing a few exercises, tearing it down, and just kind of getting you in that good habit. You can get a good workout on it if you want. The way my acer and I kind of did it was we just kind of went through the setup. He showed me, exposed me to all the different exercises and a few extra ones kind of that were kind of on the normal protocol. And then we would make sure we knew how to tear it down. And then I'd go work out in the gym for an hour. So that was our technique. Some people actually get a good workout on that machine. I prefer to just do, free weights and normal weights here on the ground, but make sure I understood. And I really honestly didn't, the first time, I didn't, even though I went through all those motions, I didn't put it all together until you get into space and see how that machine actually moves and functions. And then then the light bulb came on. I was like, now I get it. So, but really incredible machinery that we have. And those, the Acers, they don't just train us pre-flight, they train us during our flight as well. And so every week, we're generally hearing from them, getting a chance to talk to them about once every month. We'll have a video session. So we're going to video ourselves working out, and they're going to be watching live from Mission Control and be able to kind of give us feedback and help us with our form and technique and things that, we can't see sometimes when you're the operator. So that's a really nice touch point, I think. And they can, you'll work as the mission goes on, they'll increase your protocols and your stamina on the cardio side and things like that. So you work together to make sure you're getting to be the fit as you can be. And so I think one of you guys alluded to it earlier. There's problems in space with bone density loss and muscle atrophy, and these workout programs, about 2 hours a day is what we figured out. Really you can come back with zero or minimal bone loss and bone density loss. So that's pretty incredible.
So that kind of leads into another question I have, which is that, across the, I guess now decades of space flight, how dramatic of a change is that? I mean, where like Buzz Aldrin and those guys, I can't imagine they were lifting weights in space the same way that you guys are now. So what does that evolution look like?
Yeah, it's, thank goodness for me personally, I've been on the good end of that, right? Early on, the early expeditions, even to the space station, we didn't truly understand that until we started doing long duration flights. Because the short flights, most space shuttle missions were generally about 2 weeks long, and you could go 2 weeks without doing much, and you come back with minimal effects. But once we started doing long duration missions, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 months, sometimes a year, even, that some of my colleagues are doing now. If you don't work out a couple hours a day and you're not eating the right food for one and the right calorie amount every day, you're going to come back with some bone deterioration.
So you mentioned that the most physically demanding thing you do in space are the spacewalks themselves. And correct me if I'm wrong here, your NASA official bio says 9 spacewalks for 59 total hours extravehicular, right?
Correct.
Just because I have like no understanding what that consists of, other than like doing the quick math that says you're out there for 6 straight hours. What does that look like in terms of like physical demands, but also just cognitive demands of being able to deal with that environment for 6 hours?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it is 6 to 7, generally hours outside at a time, but it's a much longer than that in the suit. And you mentioned the suit doesn't really weigh anything in space, but it is a mass still of, say, 300 pounds, right? And so the way we start the process, it's a long day. Every spacewalk day is really long. You get up early. It's a team effort, right? The 2 people are going outside. The other 2 people generally are getting you suited up and getting you fed and making sure all your equipment's ready to go. And so that's a huge process. And so you're getting in the suit about 3 to 3.5 hours before you go outside the hatch. All right. So that's another several hours that you're suited up. And, about an hour into that 3.5 hours, your helmet comes on. And at that point, you can't touch your face for the next 9 or 10 hours. I mean, if you think about it, maybe 11 if it takes a while coming back in, right? So that freaks a lot of people out.
I'm getting like anxious thinking about it.
I just want to mention it because, it's part of the mental game that you got to play. And if you have an itch or scratch or you start sweating, there's not much you can do about it. So that's just kind of the mental aspect of it. And for me, those 3 or so hours of being suited and not going out the door were tough for me. Like, because I was so jacked up and ready to go, and we'd prepped and rehearsed again, and we were ready to go. But the whole process, and part of it is you're trying to get all the nitrogen out of your body, and so we're pre-breathing for several of those hours, pure oxygen, and just getting any nitrogen we can. Because if you don't, you can have potentially the bends like you do as scuba divers would have as well. And so we're preventing that by doing these pre-breathes in the suit. And so even before you get in the suit, you pre-breathe for an hour on just a mask, a pure O2 mask. And so that's not comfortable either, but just all part of the process. And you get to do all that and then eventually go outside. And so, but once that hatch opens and the spacewalk starts, boy, it's a real mental challenge. I mean, you're focusing so intently on everything you touch, everything you get, every tool you get. Make sure there's a tether on it. Every handrail you grab, make sure it's secure, so that you don't maybe go floating off. And so I don't know what you guys do that requires intense focus, but if you just imagine that intense focus for 6 to 7 hours, it's a mental strain. All right, and it's physically challenging because that 300-pound spacesuit is a mass that you're maneuvering around, and it's pressurized, meaning that you're blown up. It's not just a suit that you're in, but it's actually blown up, meaning that it gets really, really stiff. And so you're fighting the pressure of that spacesuit. Anytime you move your hands, it's kind of like if you resist with your hands and you do that for 7 hours, that's kind of what spacewalking is like, because you're doing everything with your hands. We call it spacewalking, but you really don't do anything with your feet, right? You move around with your hands. That's how you get around. You get tools, you put in new equipment, you pull out old equipment, everything you're doing out there is with your hands. And so, the gloves are very good, very capable, but they're still like, changing the oil on your car and like ski mittens, right? So it's not, the dexterity is not perfect. And so you're kind of fighting that all day as well, when you're outside, and the temperature swings. So we haven't really talked about that, but that can weigh on your body and your mental side as well. And so, don't know if you guys know, but the speeds we go around the Earth every 90 minutes. And so, as you guys know, half the Earth's light, half is dark. And so every 45 minutes, we're seeing a sunrise or a sunset when you're outside. And you're not just seeing it, you're experiencing it. And meaning that there's a big temperature swing. A lot of people say, hey, is it hot or cold in space? I'm like, yes, right? So when the sun's out, it's about 200 degrees C, almost 400 degrees Fahrenheit. So super hot. So 45 minutes of that. And then as soon as the sun goes away, you're 45 minutes minus 200. All right, so 400-degree temperature swing every 45 minutes is your suit protects you from that, thank goodness, but you definitely know it's getting hotter or colder, and depending on how much work you're doing, you'll either be perspiring or not. So all that to say, it's definitely a physical challenge out there, but I would say personally, it's more mental, and that you got to keep that focus. And if you're the lead spacewalker, like I had the privilege of doing several times, you're really looking out for your crewmates and making sure, especially if they're a rookie, they're outside for the first time, you're really making sure they're doing okay, and you're monitoring their pace, and just keeping everything kind of stable, because you only have limited amount of supplies in your backpack. Your oxygen and carbon dioxide removal and all that stuff, those are consumables, and you got to kind of monitor those, because if you go outside and you're all jacked up for 2 or 3 hours straight, you're going to be out of oxygen pretty quickly. So we got to just tone everybody down a bit, as a spacewalker. And that's part of it. Just looking out for your buddy, whether you're the lead or not, you're always looking out for your partner, making sure they're in good shape before you kind of move off to do something else.
I'm going to be honest. Everything you just said sounds miserable.
Well, there's a big payoff. I mean, for one, whatever you're going to do outside is going to help the life of the space station, right? So you're a part of something so much bigger than yourself, which is, to me, very rewarding. I think it is for most people. And every now and then, if you get lucky, you'll actually get to just hang out for a minute and look at our beautiful planet and see how incredible that view is while you're going 17,500 miles an hour. And so it is a lot of work. Don't get me wrong. I wouldn't have, hopefully you're not having any fun out there, because it's so serious. The risk is very high. It's just dangerous out there. I'm in the vacuum of space. And so the error tolerance is pretty small, and you want to make sure you're doing the right thing. and you'll probably make a few mistakes while you're out there, and you got to mentally get over that and move on. And there's so many people are counting on you to do whatever you're doing, whether you're installing a new solar array in our case in this last flight, or take out an old piece of equipment and put a new one in. Everybody on the ground that has trained you, hundreds of people that have helped you get suited up and trained you in the classroom and in the pool, they're all counting on you to do the right thing, right? So there's some pressure there, and you just got to learn how to deal with that and accomplish the mission.
So, I mean, not to go in a different direction from, I think, the trajectory that we're on, but I'm curious, what that first spacewalk, I mean, I could be wrong here, like, the door opens maybe metaphorically, but like, how does that feel as a human to just open that and be like, okay, I'm going to do this thing now? I mean, you've had plenty of hours by this point, but the first time, like, how is that?
I would say the first was not too different than any other one I did, honestly. It's like I kind of equated to jumping out of airplanes in the Army.
Mm-hmm.
If you're not a little bit nervous going out the door, there's something wrong with you. But when you open that hatch, I mean, to your point, the hatch is facing the Earth always. It's on the bottom side of the space station. And so when you open the hatch and you go out, generally you're going to go out head first. Sometimes you come out feet first, but regardless, you're going to end up in a heads up attitude where your feet are towards the Earth and your head's kind of towards the hatch. And they give you about 5 to 10 minutes if you need it, or if you want it, to just hang out and chill and try to figure out how little it takes to move around. Because on your first one, you're going to death grip everything generally because you're so jacked up, and you just don't know how little it takes to move around outside in a big spacesuit. And that takes about an hour, honestly, for most people to settle down and realize, all right, I gotta tone my pace down here. I gotta just grab, you can just fingertip grab and move yourself around instead of death grip and everything. And those kind of things are wild. A lot of my colleagues have told me and had this sensation once they come out of the hatch, they're falling to Earth, right? Because that's a pretty natural sensation, I think, if you come out of something like that. And that's a bad feeling for people, and they have to just mentally grind and get through that. But luckily, I did not have that sensation, but I was definitely prepared for it. So did my colleagues tell me to look out for it. And everybody tells you, hey, if you're lucky, you'll get to go outside at night for your first one, because that way you can't really see as much, and there aren't as many visual like overload, sensory overload going out the door. And of course, as luck would have it, I went out in the daytime, and so it's just like, wow, there's just so much to look at, and you just got to immediately get focused on what you're doing. That next handrail you're going to grab, the tether you're going to hook up to make sure you don't go floating away. All those things that your training just really kicks in. At least it did for me, and the ones that I've done. But that stuff never changed. Like I always say, kind of the first 5 or 10 minutes of that spacewalk are really, really critical to how the rest of the day is going to go. And if you can get that right, and you can just rehearse it, and we did that with the people I went outside with, to make sure everything we did in those first 5 or 10 minutes went super smoothly. And if that happens, then you're kind of just off on a good path, and you can kind of relax a little bit as you get going for the rest of the day.
So you mentioned this already, and we've talked a lot about like the physical demands of doing that, but you mentioned that it's probably more mental than it is physical. How in the screening process do they figure out what it takes psychologically and screen for that with candidates? Because the number of factors you're thinking about, because there's like performance anxiety stuff, there's isolation related stuff, there's social stuff because you're stuck up there with a small group of people. Just like that's a lot of psychological factors to work through. How do they simulate that? How do they screen for that in the process?
Yeah, it is, and it's evolved. That to answer your question, the whole process of screening for that has evolved, and it changes a little bit almost every time there's a selection. The only one I had the pleasure of really interacting with was the one I was in, and I haven't been on a selection board since I was selected. But when we did it, it was just, I don't know, 4 or 5 hours of psych testing on a computer, and then you met with the psych doc for a couple hours. So, however you answered that question of like, why don't you want to be a librarian, or what's your prettiest color flower that you like, those kind of things are like, what are they getting at here? Right? They kind of analyze all that and kind of somehow put it into a formula, and that's how they ended up helping at least pick our class of astronauts. They do a lot more now. I think we understand. I was selected in 2004, so that was almost 20 years ago. So I think that the whole arena of mental health and what you guys are talking about has come such a long way in those past 20 years that they're definitely doing more tests and putting people in real situations and seeing how they react. And I don't know the specifics, unfortunately, but they're definitely doing a lot more to try to tease out those things of picking somebody that may be claustrophobic or maybe have anxiety and those kind of things in small spaces.
I imagine we're not supposed to know exactly what they do in terms of the real situations, because I think part of it is supposed to be exposure. But
yeah,
I just
don't know.
Thinking about putting a helmet on and not being able to touch your face for 10 hours like makes my nose itch. I can't imagine.
Yeah, it's an interesting dilemma.
Somebody should engineer like a prosthetic little like robot nose scratching arm inside.
Yeah, you have the recourse you have, or I found, is you have a Valsalva device in there, meaning that if you had to clear your ears, because a lot of people have trouble clearing their ears as you're pressurizing things, there's these two little things that kind of sit wherever you want them. But if you have an itch, you can kind of use that to kind of scratch. But it just needs to be make sure it's on the correct side that you have the itch, which you don't have any control over. But once it's in there, it's in there.
I want to take it maybe back to the fitness space, and for folks that have not really read into this or haven't even, I mean, I know there's a lot of pictures. I saw some pictures of you using some of the machines that are available, but what do you have access to when you're on the space station in terms of working out, I suppose?
Yeah, these days, it's really an amazing suite, I would say, of equipment. There's a workout machine, I'll call it. It's called ARED, Advanced Resistive Exercise Device. And you can do everything on this one machine that you can do in the gym, from squats to deadlifts to curls to bench to shoulder press to abs. And the list goes on and on. You get pretty creative with it as well, with cables or with a bar. Really, really capable machine. You can get up to about a 600-pound load on that thing. And so none of us generally can do 600 pounds of anything, but it's a really capable machine. And we're on that for about an hour a day, and then about an hour of cardio. We have two cardio machines that we use. One is the treadmill T2, we call it, or Colbert is named after. Is a great treadmill. Really, I mean, of course, if you think about a treadmill in space, you've got to do something to hold yourself down. And so we have a harness we put on, and you attach yourself to the treadmill, and you can adjust kind of the pressure it's putting on your body and holding you down by these clips that we have. And you start out with a lot of clips, so it's just nice. You're just trying to figure out how to run. And then as you get better, you'll start taking clips off, and it really just compresses you down more. You're trying to use the big pelvic muscles and really exercise those, and to make sure they stay active, and those are firing so that you don't lose bone loss or don't have bone loss in those areas, or bone density loss. And we're running for 45 to 50 minutes generally on a protocol. And you have different protocols set up by your coach or your ACER that we had. And generally mine, I had 4 different ones. Generally, there was a kind of called a sprint, where you kind of warmed up for 3 or 4 minutes, and then you start doing intervals of 200s. And so you did however many 200s, probably about 20 or so, with a little rest in between. You're still running, but you're not sprinting, and that ends up being about 45 minutes. And then the next time I would get on there, it would be 400s. All right. So and of course the times that you're running and the times that you're resting are lengthened a little bit. And then the other protocol I had were 800s. So those are always fun. And then I had kind of what they called it a Sunday jog. So it's just like a 3 to 4 mile jog, kind of steady pace. And so you can kind of, generally I kind of went in that order when I'd get on the machine, but every now and then I just felt like sprinting, or I felt like just a jog because I wouldn't, something didn't feel right that day or whatever. And so that's a really great machine. And we kind of would alternate that daily with the call it a stationary bike, but it's the cycle ergometer. It's not stationary at all. None of these machines, by the way, they all are on what we call VISs, vibration isolation systems. So they're all floating in themselves, just so that we're not putting stress into the structure of the International Space Station. When you did a heavy rep, or you kind of ran hard and hit something. And so that's an interesting way to ride a bike. I will say it's kind of like, I equate it to being on a unicycle. Riding it on a trampoline is kind of the feel that you have when you're riding that cycle ergometer. You're upright and your arms are behind you. Like, we don't have handlebars in front like you would on a bike in the gym, for instance, or on a real bike, but they're behind us. So you're kind of standing up and you're riding this thing. And so it's really a balancing, a good core exercise just to get on this thing and keep it upright. And you get some really, we have other, protocols, whether you want a hill or a sprint and all those kind of things that you have in a normal gym. Our ACERs will set those up as well. But really, I think really amazing machines to keep our cardio up, and to keep our strength up while you're on the space station.
Just for those listening, I'd highly recommend, if you're like nerding out about this stuff, to go look at videos of them using the machines. The vibration isolation systems are pretty cool. Like when they're using the resistance machine, the machine moves in the opposite direction, the same amount they're moving, so it's all stabilized. And the bike is way funkier than you'd think. It has neither a seat nor normal handlebars, because like seats don't work in space. You can't like sit on something, so they're just kind of like strapped with their back to something, and like you have to do the upward and the downward movement. You can't just like push on the pedals and expect it to go. It's a whole different experience.
Yeah, very true. And the Russians have a few more devices on their end, which I didn't get. They have kind of their own bike and their own treadmill, and kind of a bungee system that they do abs with. But they come over to use our exercise machine, the ARED.
This begs the obvious series of questions. Do you guys ever throw down? Russian versus American in space in terms of a lift off, perhaps a run off or a cycle off? Who wins?
We did not do that. That's a great idea, though. But
seriously,
the biggest competition we had was we had our SpaceX crew up there last time when I was up there, and we had the Russian Soyuz crew. One of those was an American, but 2 cosmonauts. And we were up there during the Tokyo Olympics, and so we actually had a Space Olympics one day. And we had some fierce competition, all kinds of activities, as you might imagine. There's some good video out there, probably on YouTube, about that. But it was a lot of fun competing against them all day, or for a couple hours one day, as we got creative with all these space sports. But that was pretty fun.
So we do not currently, Mops and Mo's, generate any revenue whatsoever. So we don't have a huge budget, but we would love to sponsor an International Space Station Russian versus American fitness competition.
Yeah, we'll always, well, yeah, that'd be interesting to see how that would work out. I would say it probably had to be vehicle by vehicle, kind of like we did it, just to keep the peace. But yeah, I hear what you're saying.
What is the I mean, getting into the weeds here, what's the music preference for a workout in space? Or are you allowed to listen to music?
Oh yeah, kind of ironically, all our cardio workouts I mentioned were about 45 minutes or so. Well, every hour-long TV show in the U.S., if you take out the commercials, they're all 42 minutes, right? So generally, we're watching a TV show or a movie while you're doing cardio, and then while you're lifting, you're cranking up music, or we have earbuds and pods and stuff that you wear up there as well. So yeah, it just depends on who you are and what you like. You can have whatever music you want. They'll send it up to you. Same with TV shows or movies. You just give them your preferences before you go, and then when you get up there, they're already loaded and ready for you. So pretty sweet.
That is so neat. One of the questions I had leading into this, and it's kind of a weird one, but it came to mind as I was thinking of the training in the 2 hours. I don't want to sound dumb. Obviously, you're going to sweat. How is that handled? Because I can imagine you don't want it just floating around the space station, but you guys are training a considerable amount.
Yep. Yeah, you definitely are sweating, like I was drenched every time I worked out. Put in the work, you're going to be sweating, right? I mean, it's
right.
Generally about 72, 73 degrees on the space station, but when you're working hard, you're going to be sweating, and you have to manage that. Now, it's not going to go like floating off the sweat unless you just happen to like shake your head real hard. Then bead of sweat would go floating off. But I always had a towel or a washcloth nearby. Start sweating, I just wipe it off. Some people like ran with headbands or something as well. I did not do that, but some people do that just to manage the sweat. But you got to have something there. Otherwise, it's generally kind of, even if you're running and you touch something, then it's just going to flow off your hand to whatever you're touching and that kind of stuff. But you're going to wipe the equipment down after every workout, and of course, clean yourself up as well before you head off to do your next activity.
I was listening to you earlier today talk about how when you guys pee in space, it gets recycled and becomes drinking water. Part of it does. Is like your sweaty laundry the same way, or is that a whole different process?
Any condensation or liquid. So yeah, sweat could fall into that category. If it gets liberated, will get, kind of sucked up by the machines that we have on the space station and get put into that same system. Now our clothes, our laundry, we don't have a laundry facility up there. And so you have a certain number of days you're supposed to wear everything. And once that day hits, then you throw it out. It's all trash after that. So workout clothes get pretty nasty by the end of, you're supposed to wear them all once you get one pair a week. So by the end of the week, you're ready to get rid of those and put some fresh ones on.
So you get one pair of clothes a week to work out in for 2 hours a day, and
Yeah,
you can't wash it. You can't. It just hangs out in the space station.
exactly.
How does that? What is it? What does it smell like on the International Space Station?
The first time I went back in 2008, when they opened the hatch to the space station, to me it smelled like a locker room or a gym. It just had that smell. And then the last 2 times I've gone up, the systems have gotten much better, and I like noticed no difference. So even though 4 or 5 people on the U.S. side are working out every day, and you're kind of hanging your stuff up to dry, air dry every day, the circulation system and the air conditioning system do a really great job to take out the odors and take out any kind of locker room smell. And so they figured that one out, thank goodness.
I love that. In one of the articles, it might have been Men's Health that you were interviewed in, there was discussion about a lot of hip-based movements, deadlifts, squats, things like that, as being really important for, I suppose, the specificity of what it means to be an astronaut. Aside from those two, like, what are some of the other big ones that you would consider to be like must-haves for this type of work?
You mean like with our normal workout routine on the
Sure.
space station?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, just to give you an idea, like literally start out every day with squats and deadlifts, and you're doing 50 to 75 each. All right. So, I mean, you're doing a lot of reps and with pretty heavy weights. So, you get with your Acer. For me, I was doing either 4 sets of 6 with 2 warm-up sets. Let's see, 4 sets of 6 was kind of the heavy weight, right? And then if you do like 5 sets of 8, you'd be a little lighter weight. And then you do sets of 12 was another repetition that we did, just lighter weight, but a lot more reps. And you kind of rotated through that cycle every day you did it. But there's some kind of squats. Sometimes it's regular squats. Sometimes it's sumo. Sometimes it's single leg squats up there. And so that kind of cycled every third day. You're always doing either a deadlift or a sumo deadlift every day. Heel raises are really big, just to keep your heels kind of activated, because you're not walking or anything up there. And so just keeping that, you do like 4 sets of 20 heel raises pretty much every day, part of your leg stuff before you kind of switched over to upper body. I think things like that I just mentioned, those exercises are kind of the big core ones. Our Acers, or my Acer, would tell you, it's great if you do bench and curls and tries, but that's not really going to help you. Your overall body. It's not going to help your bone density as much as doing the squats and the deadlifts and the heel raises.
So, like, this will probably come up in your intro, which we're going to record separately from the episode. But you were an athlete in college. You played baseball. How do you think that background contributed to both your success in getting through astronaut selection, but your ability to handle kind of that routine in space? Do you think there's a connection there?
Absolutely. I mean, sports in general, as you guys know, I think are just there's so many life lessons you learn in sports, right? For me with baseball, the team aspect, the discipline aspect, you got to rely on your buddy. When you make a mistake, hopefully your buddy's going to pick you up. All those kind of things certainly transferred over. For me, knowing the importance of stretching, I was a pitcher, and just trying to keep your arm healthy and stretching and icing it after you threw, and all that kind of rehab stuff definitely is what we do at NASA with our bodies. When you get you go to space and you come back and your body is kind of wrecked, and it needs a lot of TLC to get it back to fighting shape, so to speak. And just kind of having that mentality of doing it before with playing baseball in college was certainly natural for me. Where I actually saw other crewmates of mine who didn't come from the athletic background, they struggled a little more when they got home, because they just didn't want to do it and didn't maybe realize the benefits of having that. So I think I was a little bit of a leg up on that one on most of my crewmates.
So you mentioned, I mean, stretching and injury prevention type stuff. What does that look like when you're in space? Because it's one thing for a coach, down here on Earth to prescribe you training and manage some of that. But I mean, I'm thinking of aches, pains, niggles, et cetera, that athletes experience while they're training. How do you guys handle that? What does that look like?
Yeah, I had a couple issues, and most people do while you're up there. You're going to have something go. For me, generally, it's my back. I'll throw my back out for a day or two and have to work through that. To me, in in space, it kind of went away much quicker. There's not all the pressure on your joints and things, but still something you had to deal with. And we had some shoulder issues with some of my crewmates that were a little more serious that we had to work through with kind of guidance from our ACERs, and also a PT on the ground and another doctor. I was kind of the person guiding this other crewmate through exercises to try to rehab them. And so it's a great team effort all around, as we're, kind of experiencing these little tweaks and things. And ideally they won't affect something big, or, hey, I can't do this thing today because I got hurt. And that's the goal. But sometimes it'll maybe affect a spacewalk, and you can't actually go out and do a spacewalk, and all that planning and prep that the team has done has to be put on hold. And that happened while we were up there one time. And it was, it's tough for that crew member to make that call, but it was absolutely the right call. But a very challenging one mentally to make. But it was the right thing, because they just did not have the strength that was required to go outside due to an injury they have.
So this is a question based on stuff I've heard, but I've been wrong on this episode already, so I don't know.
Yeah, you can come back stronger from space, Alex,
Right.
obviously.
I'm sure there's a whole bunch of like medical screenings and research things that happen immediately after you come back to Earth after a space flight. But I also understand there's like a month and a half of kind of reconditioning, like getting used to Earth gravity again. And you talked like you can't really train balance and coordination very well where you're in space. What does that reconditioning period look like? Like, what was your experience with the getting used to living on Earth again part of training?
Yeah, I mean, your body just feels really weird coming back to gravity. It's a strange environment, floating around. And microgravity is kind of your new normal. And so just your inner ear trying to figure out, where it is, your sense of balance, and your coordination's a little off. To me, even though your body just tells you don't go work out, to me, if I could just get to the gym and get a workout in, kind of the healing process, so to speak, was on. And the quicker I could do that and get moving, the better off I was. And as an example, Megan, who was our pilot on this last mission, she and I signed up for this test post-flight, and you sign up for things and you have no idea how you're going to feel. Sometimes you're just like, yeah, I can't do it, sorry. But we signed up for this thing, and we were trying to give the mission planners at NASA, who were trying to figure out, hey, if it takes 6 months to get to Mars, we don't really have an analog for that. So we're going to bring these people home after a 6 month or so flight. If we can get a few tests in and see what they can actually do and can't do, it'll just give us a better idea to what to expect when somebody goes to Mars, right? So Megan and I raised our hands, and the test we were going to do was actually get in a lunar spacesuit. All right. So get in another closed environment, crazy thing, and actually do a bunch of physical tasks, like, walking around first of all. And then they put us in this rock yard where it's kind of like a beach with a bunch of boulders in there that you have to walk over, which takes some coordination. And then they had us kind of pick up sandbags and carry them 10 meters and drop them off, pick up another one, and see how many we could do in like a 10-minute stretch. And we're just trying, honestly, not to throw up, and because again, you don't feel great. But boy, as strenuous as that was for both of us, as soon as we got through that, our bodies kind of just started turning the corner, and we just started feeling better. And so that motivated me mentally to get, kind of the next day, get the gym, get going at getting after it, and my body started kind of the healing process. I don't know if you guys heard, but I was kind of racing the clock to get home. Our mission kept getting delayed, which is not unusual, but my daughter was getting married, and she had a certain date, and it was getting pretty close that I wasn't going to make it. But I landed about 10 days before she got married. And so that first week home, I was in the gym hitting it hard, just so I could, I had some extra motivation to be able to walk her down the aisle and it looked somewhat normal. So my ACERs did a great job getting me ready for that task.
That's fantastic. And this is less of a question and more of something I had not thought about at all until I had the conversation with Judy about the spaceflight physiology stuff. But this is for the soldiers listening who complain about how like other things get in the way of PT all the time, even though we say it's the most important thing we do every day. That is also the case with astronauts, like both pre-flight, post-flight. There are plenty of things that get prioritized and get in the way of their physical training, even when we're talking about the stakes being like spacewalks and these guys being the focus of that many resources. It's not something I had thought about at all. It kind of threw me for a loop a little bit, thinking about like when it's that critical, there's still a whole bunch of other stuff it'll step on PT time.
Absolutely. And you just, it's got to be a personal thing, as I found out, not just in the Army, but at NASA. It's got to be personal for you. Otherwise, you'll prioritize something else in front of it, right? Just knowing the benefits of it, and in the military, the benefits it's going to provide you or your crewmate that you may be having to drag out of a vehicle or a helicopter or something, in a bad situation. You want to be ready for that.
So this is more of a military question than a fitness question, but if I'm not mistaken, you were in command of the space station end of 2016, beginning of 2017. What does command look like in the NASA space station? Like, do you give orders in that setting? Are there court martials in space if somebody does something wrong?
There's no lifting competitions. We found that out.
Do you have leadership control over other countries' astronauts? Like, I'm just fascinated by what command means on the space station.
Great question. It's, in a way, it's not much different than being a commander of a military unit, where you're ultimately responsible for everybody in your command and anything that's done, right? So command for me means a lot of different things, but bottom line is taking care of your people, making sure that you have your pulse on what's going on with them, even though it's hard. And it's hard, as an Army commander, I went through that and tried to learn, the best I could through that experience. It's hard on the space station as well, because you got people, in our case, from 4 or 5 different countries that don't necessarily operate on the way that you've operated, and they're not military, some of them. And some of them you don't see all day because they're down on the other side of the space station working. And so you've got to make the extra effort. You've got to, take time out of maybe something that you're supposed to be doing to go check on the cosmonauts, in my case, and just have tea with them, because that's what they like to do every day at a certain time of day. And that's a kind of a bonding time that we had, and really it's, all this stuff, let me take a step back. All this stuff starts in our training as we lead up to a mission, right? And the investment that the commander is going to make with that team is going to pay huge dividends once you get on the mission. And so I was very calculated, I would say, but genuine, as we were training and just trying to get people, get to know the person, not just the astronaut or the cosmonaut, but get to know the person, their families, what makes them tick, really investing in them through the training process, having social events, and just seeing people outside of work really helps me to understand them a little more deeply, obviously, and that just pays huge dividends. We got to the point where we were, setting expectations is a big thing for any commander. Communication is as well. We can go on and on, but setting expectations was one thing that really paid off. I just told my crew before we launched, these are the expectations that I expect when we get up there. And boy, that just, little did I know how huge that was going to be, because if you have an emergency, you have whatever, and those things are going to happen while you're up there. Because we had kind of talked through expectations beforehand, everything went super smoothly. So I can't reiterate how important that is as the leader. And sometimes, you don't have to do everything as the leader. That's another thing that I learned in the Army. You have great people around you, so empower them, delegate things to them, give them responsibilities so that they can grow. And I got the chance to do that as a commander of the space station, to let other people do spacewalks, let other people use the robotic arm to grab a vehicle that's coming up instead of me kind of doing everything. So it was really rewarding for me to watch them grow and to build them up as people, first of all, and as astronauts or cosmonauts after that.
That's awesome. I mean, it's hard to even imagine the concept of commanding in space.
How do geopolitical tensions on Earth affect the environment in the space station? I realize that's totally unrelated to where we're going with this, but just out of curiosity, does that play into it at all?
It really depends on the crew, but yeah, great question, especially with what's going on currently.
Right.
So we didn't have anything major like that when I was up there on any of my trips, but we had elections and we had other things, and those kind of topics would generally come up while we were on board, and that was an expectation I also set before we launched with my crew, that generally we're not going to talk politics. We're going to keep that off the table, and we're just going to, enjoy each other while we're sitting around the dinner table and floating around eating our dinners or whatever. But, and that, for the most part, that, somebody will mix it in every now and then, but you kind of just got to redirect and make sure, hey, remember what we talked about beforehand? That's not helping the crew and the environment. And they explain it to them once again. They're like, "Oh,
leave it on Earth, guys."
That's right. So I'll tell you, the cosmonauts, and the astronauts were very, very similar people in the way we were trained, the way we were brought up, the way we would do things in space. And so we're generally very compatible. And it's really neat to learn another culture, right? I had French, Japanese, and Russians on my flights, and just awesome to be able to live with them and share that's really your space family, and share kind of life with them for 6+ months at a time, and get to see how they do things, and learn different languages, of course, but learn different cultures, which was really a huge benefit of going to the International Space Station.
So this one might be too nerdy. This might be a question for a physiologist working at NASA instead of an astronaut. But one thing that I found fascinating, because it is like an answer to problems we have in the Army, I think. But NASA has something called the Complement of Integrated Protocols for Human Exploration Research, or CIPHER, where they've basically laid out, like, the whole staff of physiologists, researchers, exercise science, whatever, have, like, doctors, all of it, have gotten together and figured out, like, these are the next things we need to understand about how space affects humans. And that list is published to kind of drive the research direction for both, like, on space station research and Earth-based terrestrial research, I guess, to help answer, like, all the questions that the planners have for lunar missions and Mars missions and all these kinds of things. My question is, do you think there's a world, because you were an Army guy before you were an astronaut, do you think there's a world where the DoD or the Army come up with something more structured like that? Because, like, Drew and I talk about this all the time, but we see a lot of human performance research happening that's not answering the questions practitioners actually have. It's just research going in whatever direction researchers feel like going. Do you think there's a world where we could kind of learn that lesson from NASA of structuring, like, hey, here are the things we wish we understood better about human performance. Please research these.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's NASA, like the group you mentioned, they're doing a great job of just trying to think ahead, right? Trying to, Moon, Mars, it's different up there. It's different than being on the space station. And how's the body going to be different? And the physical performance measures are going to be different and factors. So Army, I think, it seems like at least a part of it is thought a little bit differently, right? With the ACFT versus the APFT. And hey, that's a little more functional from, I'm not sure everybody loves it or not, but it's just, they're trying to think, hey, what's really things that we're really looking for on the battlefield, right? Which is, I would say the Moon and Mars would equate to the battlefield in our situation. And so I think that's good. I don't know if they're hitting the mark right, or we need to adjust and do something else. But certainly they could learn from this group, right? To try to, not just set out goals, but to have the research, like you were talking about, really line up so that you can actually get there and get some good results, and then have a better fighting force down the road.
So this is pivoting away from that, kind of back to stuff we were talking about before. But as I understand it, the space station as a project is scheduled to end in 2030. As someone who lived on it, as someone who commanded it, as someone who has spent so much of their life revolved around those missions,
those missions.
Yeah. How do you feel about that? And, like, what do you think that means for the future of human space exploration?
I've been around NASA for a couple of decades now, right? And the priorities change, right? So it's politically driven generally. And so, like, for example, when I got there, the space shuttles were kind of towards the end of their life. We got a chance to fly on those, our class did. And then shortly after that, they went away because the priorities shifted. The International Space Station was complete at that point from the U.S. perspective. So we didn't need this, this huge, amazing vehicle that carried every piece up there pretty much and put the space station together. So the decision was made for that to go away, okay, because we wanted to have a new vehicle that was going to go to deep space eventually. And honestly, NASA didn't have the budget to do space shuttle, space station, and a new vehicle. And so if you just look at the money and the politics, that kind of drove space shuttles ending at some point. And then the money could then be used to build a future spacecraft, which is Orion now, that you guys are probably familiar with. It'll take astronauts to the moon, around the moon here in the next year or so, and then put people on the surface of the moon here in the next probably 3 or 4 years. So that vehicle is built, and we had the money to do it. And, eventually here in the next few years, like you mentioned, space station will probably fade out and be retired. And because that's our focus at NASA, or the NASA focus, will be deep space kind of at that point. So the priorities have shifted, and kind of politically things would have shifted in the next few years to kind of enable all that to happen. Now, if maybe the space station becomes a private entity and other agencies or outside of NASA or Roscosmos or the European Space Agency or Japanese Space Agency, somebody else is controlling it on the private side, that may happen, but I think that would be really challenging for a private company to do that. But that's an option. If not, eventually they're going to have to deorbit the space station, and there's already plans made to do that in the South Pacific. And so whenever that day comes, to me, it's just kind of a logical stepping stone to continue to move forward, right? We've been on the space station for several decades now, and we've learned a lot. There's always more to learn, but at some point you kind of got to push the next set of boundaries, the next frontier, which will be deep space for humans.
So just to clarify and make sure we paint a clear picture for everybody listening, when you say deorbit over the South Pacific, you mean
into the ocean.
We're going to watch the space station like burn through the atmosphere and crash into the ocean.
Yep. So a lot of it will burn up as it comes through the atmosphere, but there will be big pieces that still make it through, and they've already figured out exactly where it's going to go. That plan's been in place for many years.
Wow.
Deorbit. That might be one of my new favorite words. That sounds way better than crash into the ocean.
a little softer.
Yeah. I mean, I guess kind of working towards a close now and talking about the future of space travel, and obviously SpaceX comes to mind, sort of the commercialization of all that. And having been in the NASA ecosystem and what I can imagine is incredibly structured. I mean, we've talked about the training and the individualization of all of it and everything that goes into, being in space. What do you think that means for commercializing this type of thing and just sort of going up, coming down? I mean, like how do you think that looks? And is that something that's being considered? I mean, I don't even know how to ask this question because it's so far outside of my scope, but does that make sense?
Yeah, I think what you're getting at is there's commercial astronauts these days, and I'd call them professional astronauts like we are.
There you go.
I don't know if those are the proper terms, but just make it simple. Let's keep it like that.
Sure.
Any interest in the space program is good for NASA overall, right? So more companies, I mean, there's a lot of startup companies now, not even startups anymore, but companies that have, really goals of putting people in space, and the more the better is the way I look at it. So it's not like, oh, they're taking away our astronauts. I mean, it's totally different, right? It's a different mission. Now, some of the private astronauts have gone to the space station. You may have heard the second mission went just a few months ago. They took private astronauts up for about a week to 10 days on the space station, and then they came home. So short trip, but they were living and breathing the same place that my colleagues did.
The locker room.
Yeah, in the locker room. So, does that make them do? I mean, they trained, right? But they didn't train for those 2 years, like we did. And but they trained for several months, maybe in a year, because of delays and things. And so they're getting a lot of training and becoming astronauts themselves, just kind of in a different way. So I don't see that being a bad thing. It's just kind of expanding the boundaries, and the whole industry is getting better and better because of it, because of the competition. Honestly, NASA thinks a lot differently now than we did before SpaceX came along. I'll tell you that. So they've helped NASA think out of the box a little more. NASA has helped SpaceX. Like SpaceX, a great company, they just didn't have any experience with human spaceflight, right? So NASA really, and I kind of got to grow up with that whole process over the last 5 or 6 years with SpaceX, and so it was really neat to see them grow and learn, and us really work together to make it happen.
Nice. Okay, I've got 2 speed round closers for you.
Okay.
Number 1. You're in space. You've got these, fancy workout machines on gyroscopes. What is one component of, we'll call it terrestrial fitness, that you miss the most while you're in space? Or is there a component that you miss while you're in space?
Yeah, the biggest component for me is just nature, right? Feeling the wind, feeling even rain while you're running, feeling a breeze, smelling dirt or smelling grass, just all those senses that you just don't have up there.
Yeah, stationary bike with your hands behind you in a space station that smells like a locker room, I can imagine is a beautiful experience. And then now that those days are sort of behind you, what does your exercise routine look like now? Are you training for anything?
I'm not training for anything. I run about 4 or 5 days a week, 2.5 to 3.5 miles, somewhere in there. Kind of hot these days in Houston. Mm-hmm. So we're on the low end of that, just mainly because of the limitations of my dog, not myself. But, I always love running with my dog. And then I'll work out in a gym Ideally, if I'm in town 3 days a week, if I'm on the road, then I just got to mix it in a hotel room or so. But I try to do something every day. Maybe one day, on a weekend or something, I'll take a day off to let my body recover if I really worked out hard or something. But generally, I try to do something every day.
Nice. Well, I know we've taken you up to the hour mark, and I wanted to say thank you for coming on. This has been, we could go a million different directions with just like little boy astronaut curiosity questions, but we'll cut ourselves off. So thank you for coming on and talking to us. We appreciate it.
This has been incredible. Thank you.
My pleasure, guys. Great meeting you guys. Look forward to seeing it.
Yeah, thanks. Hey, Alex, let's cover our ass real quick.
Oh, great idea, Drew. All right, guys. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities they represent.
Thanks for tuning into this week's episode. Before you go, please rate and review the pod on the listening platform of your choice. You can also visit us on our website at www.mopsinmos.com. That's mops, the letter N, mos.com. You can check out the library of podcast episodes, our latest blog entries, any helpful resources, and also sign up for our newsletter.
Drew nailed it. Just to underline a couple of things, the podcast entries have in-depth show notes on the website. So if you missed anything or you want to read any of the research we talk about, it is all there. You can, at the bottom of the website, sign up with your email and receive future updates from us. The blog posts go a little bit more in depth in kind of written form on a couple of topics we get questions about all the time. But most importantly, I just want to ask all you guys, our best way the word gets out is absolutely word of mouth. So tell your friends, tell the people you work with, anybody you think would find it useful. Thanks for spreading the word.
If you have any questions or comments, feel free to shoot us an email at either Drew or Alex at mopsinmos.com.
Or there's a contact form on the website.
Thank you.